Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. We're going to talk about some things that are happening inside academia and the consequences that it has on society. So the premise or background of this video comes from an article that I saw where it says Hegseth is waging war on university partnerships and his targets are unclear. Now, while I'm not going to do a deep dive on that entire article, I want to go and take a deeper dive on the patterns that I am noticing that is happening inside of higher education that is having an impact on our society. So if that sounds like something to make you say, then stay tuned and watch the rest of the video. So we're going to talk about how federal funding quietly reshapes universities. And I'll try to link the full article down below if I'm able to do so. Sometimes you need a subscription, but a quick Google search will let you know. But once again, I'm not going to dissect the article, but we're going to talk about the broader impact that something like this can have. So most people focus on what universities say, but the most important question is what incentives shape their decisions. And universities are often presented as independent institutions of knowledge, places where research is guided by curiosity, academic debate, and scholarly expertise. And historically, that independence has been a central part of their legitimacy. But universities don't operate in isolation like a lot of people think. They operate inside of systems of incentive. Those incentives often look like funding structures, government partnerships, research grants, compliance requirements, and those incentives can quietly shape the direction universities take, often without anyone issuing any direct orders. So that raises a deeper question. How much influence can funding structures have over institutions that are supposed to be independent? So hi, if you're new here, I am Dr. Vernita Glenn-White. I go by Dr. V. And if you're wondering my expertise in this area, I've spent over about 20 years in education, about 10 of those, let's say maybe about 8 of those in higher ed, whether that was getting my own doctoral degree or teaching at universities and other partnerships as well. So let's get back into the institutional design on how this all breaks down. A recent debate in higher education highlights exactly how this dynamic works. After a federal Dear Colleague letter aimed at restricting diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives were ruled illegal by a lower court, the administration involved withdrew its appeal. Now, at first glance, that might have looked like the end of the policy effort, but shortly afterward, a different strategy began to emerge. Rather than relying on direct policy directive, federal agencies began exploring changes to grant certification programs for institutions receiving federal assistance. And I'm smiling because if you know anything about higher education, a lot of them run on grants. So this might sound technical, but the mechanism is powerful. Universities that apply for federal funding must certify that they comply with the range of requirements. See where we're going? And those certifications apply not only to research grants, but also federal loans, cooperative agreements, and other forms of financial support. So in other words, funding eligibility becomes tied to institutional behavior, and that's where the incentives begin to matter. So let's break down this incentive structure. Governments rarely need to directly command universities to change course. Instead, influence often works through eligibility systems. If access to funding requires certain certifications or compliance standards, universities must decide how to respond. Now, a few questions arise. Do they adjust policies to avoid risk? Do they eliminate programs that might be scrutinized? Or do they change hiring, training, or partnerships in order to remain eligible? These decisions aren't usually framed as political, they're framed as risk management because universities rely heavily on external funding streams to sustain their operations. Research universities in particular, you may hear them called R1 institutions. They depend on federal grants for a few things such as laboratories, faculty positions, graduate student support, and major research initiatives. Now, I know a lot of people think that, well, students' tuitions should be funding the universities, but that's just a small piece of how these universities operate. So when access to those funds become uncertain, institutional leaders begin asking very practical questions. And one main question they ask, whether out loud or internally, is what changes might be necessary to maintain eligibility. Now let's talk about the hidden patterns. What this reveals is a broader institutional pattern. Universities are often described as independent knowledge institutions, but they are also large organizations operating inside financial and regulatory ecosystems. Those ecosystems reward certain behaviors. They create initiatives that shape priorities. And over time, those incentives influence what research receives support, which academic programs expand, what partnerships universities pursue, and how institutions interpret policy risk. None of this requires a government agency to directly control a university. The system itself creates the pressure, and institutions adapt accordingly. Now, the dynamic is not unique to higher education. We see it in many sectors where funding structures shape institutional behaviors. But in the case of universities, the implications are particularly significant because universities help produce the knowledge systems that influence the rest of society. So, what are the downstream consequences? When universities adjust their behavior in response to funding incentives, those changes rarely stay confined to campus. They ripple outward. Universities train the next generation of professionals. They produce research that informs public policy. They influence medical practices, technological innovation, and economic thinking. Business schools shape management frameworks used by executives. Medical schools shape how doctors understand health and nutrition. Public policy programs shape how future government officials think about regulation and governments. And education programs impact what's being taught in our K-12 schools. So when institutional incentives influence universities, they also influence the knowledge pipelines that shape society. In other words, funding systems don't just affect universities, they affect the intellectual infrastructure that informs decision making across industries. Now, think about this closing perspective. None of this means universities lack agency or the capacity to make free choices or exert their power. Academic institutions still contain enormous diversity of thought. Faculty challenge policies all the time, and I know that firsthand. Students push institutions to evolve. Again, I know about that firsthand. And research often produces unexpected discovery. I know that firsthand as well. But it does mean the idea of complete independence is more complicated than it appears. Universities operate inside systems of initiatives, as we discussed, and those initiatives quietly shape the direction knowledge takes. So when we see debates about higher education policies, it's worth paying attention to not only the headlines, but the structure behind them. Because what starts inside universities rarely stay there. Eventually, those decisions ripple outward into industries, institutions, and the systems that the rest of us live inside. Let me know your thoughts below, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one. Bye.